Steve, tell us what happened.
Well, I'm trying to tell you. Now, this thing had killed the doc.
Well, what was it?
Stop with it, kid.
But it's kind of like a mass that keeps getting bigger and bigger.
Come on, Steve, make sense.
I know. Look, Dave, you gotta see this thing to believe what I'm telling you. Maybe the thing you saw was a monster?
Hello, and welcome to every single sci-fi film ever. I'm Aisha Khan. Today we'll be talking about the 1958 film The Blob, but before we get to that, I'm going to do a quick overview of the big films from the year before, 1957. The biggest grossing film from 1957 is A Bridge Over the River Kwai, which was also a huge hit at the Oscars. Other memorable films from 1957, amongst many, are An Affair to Remember, starring Deborah Kerr and Cary Grant, Witness for the Prosecution by Billy Wilder and starring Marlene Dietrich, and in Bollywood, it was the year that Mother India, which is a huge hit, was released. My absolutely favourite film to recommend to people who do not like black and white films was also released that year, which is 12 Angry Men. I consider it a gateway film for those who refuse to watch anything before colour was invented. It was also sadly the year that Humphrey Bogart passed away. Now on to The Blob, and as always, there are spoilers ahead. The producer, Jack Harris, claimed the idea for the film and the story came from a friend of his, and it was then adapted by Theodore Simonson and Kate Phillips. But I spoke to someone on Blue Sky called Robert W. Scott, who luckily told me that in 1953, the cover story on Weird Tales magazine was Slime, which was written by Joseph Payne Brennan. The story involved a large, admittedly black gooey mass rather than a red one, which consumes all types of things, including humans. So thank you for that, Robert. The Blob was an independent production, costing somewhere between $110,000 and $130,000. It wasn't filmed anywhere near Los Angeles or Hollywood, but was filmed in Pennsylvania in the towns of Phoenixville, Downingtown, and Chester Springs. Every year in Phoenixville, there is an annual Blobfest where people celebrate the film. Producer Jack Harris approached ordained Methodist minister Irvin Yeworth to make the film. Although Yeworth had made a feature film before, he was more used to making educational religious films. But Harris obviously convinced him, and the magic of The Blob was born. Now on to my wonderful guests. Roger Luckhurst is a professor at Birkbeck, University of London. He has written/edited a silly number of books and articles on cultural history and film. Welcome back to the show, Roger. How are you doing?
It's lovely to be here. I'm very much looking forward to this.
Great. Joining Roger is Matthew Rule Jones, who is a doctor of science fiction. He is also a senior lecturer of film studies at the University of Exeter and the author of Science Fiction Cinema and 1950s Britain, Recontextualising Cultural Anxiety. Welcome back to the show, Matt. How are you?
I'm wonderful. How are you doing?
I'm doing okay. Thank you so much. I think we'll just start off with talking about the people behind the film before we jump into the actual story and plot. So, Roger.
A film directed by Irving Yeworth, who was... he did a few kind of B-movies. They're nearly always about teenagers falling into bad ways, usually ending up with, starting with rock music, ending up with heroin. That's usually what happens.
Parents, do you actually know what your sons and daughters do for thrills and kicks?
He was someone who was involved in evangelical Christianity, so quite a strong moralistic code behind it. He worked with the very, very famous Billy Graham for quite a long time, and also weirdly built Christian theme parks for quite a lot of his career as well. And was, heavily involved in that world and creating these kind of weird model Jerusalems, which apparently we've been doing in the West since the medieval period, which is really odd. And then the producer was Jack Harris, and he's also someone who is somewhat legendary in this kind of area too.
I didn't know about the model Jerusalems and Christian theme parks. That's fascinating. I always find that sort of stuff really interesting, but there's no trace of that really in, limited trace of it in the film, I suppose, which always kind of interests me when people have these kind of passionate, fervent beliefs outside of their art that just really don't kind of find an anchor in the work that they produce. I mean, it's a merry old band of rogues, really, isn't it? It's a group of people who are, I think, in many ways, kind of figuring things out as they go and trying their luck at stuff. So you get people who, as you say, have kind of come from all sorts of different walks of life, and have now found themselves here with a bit of a budget and some kind of crazy sci-fi to tell. And I think that kind of haphazardness of the coming together of these people, it's part of the charm of this movie. I think, we'll talk more about this, I'm sure, as we go on. But there's a real kind of lovely randomness to this movie, right? That sort of fits in its moment and also doesn't, and also is a bit weird, and also is a forecast of things to come. And I like to think that when I picture kind of this movie being made, it always feels a bit like this kind of like a coming together of different people, each with their own interests, each with their own experiences, none of which really coheres, but ends up producing some beautiful chaos in the meantime.
Yoa's first feature film is called The Flaming Teenage, and as Roger said, it is exactly that kind of story that, rock and roll, alcohol, and then you are destitute on the streets and life is over. And that kind of moral panic completely disappears in this film. I know that you were talking a little bit about, and we spoke about this on the comics episode of the podcast, but the moral panic of the 1950s and the threat of juvenile delinquency is still very much an issue, like heading into the late 50s.
Yeah, you're absolutely spot on, Aisha. So what we get here is a weird kind of moment in American history where the teenager has kind of come of age, as it were. The concept of the teenager is starting to come of age. So during the 50s, you get the emergence of the category of the teenager. People start to think of people as teenagers for the first time. That didn't really exist before. Then, by the point where that's occurring, teenageness is kind of bound up in the American imaginary with notions of juvenile delinquency, and not necessarily the sort of juvenile delinquency that we might think nowadays. It's not kind of, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. It's like riding hot rods around town and you're being out past your officially sanctioned bedtime and things like that. It's quite a nice version of juvenile delinquency. Like it's like cuddly juvenile delinquency. So you get a period around about this time where there are a lot of kind of what were framed at the time as social problem films or juvenile delinquency films that are actually like the most harmless thing you've ever seen. So there's a company around this time, AIP, that is American International Productions. It really kind of taps into a formula. It's very explicit about this. It's kind of well-established Hollywood history, this. The AIP comes along and says, well, a younger child is not going to watch, an older child is not going to watch what a younger child will watch. In their philosophy, at least, although I might question this, a girl is not going to watch what... a boy is not going to watch what a girl will watch. So your target audience is going to be kind of older teenage men. And so they make a raft of films about hot rods and sexy encounters that are kind of slightly off screen and slightly on screen in a cheeky way. They design their posters first so that they can make sure that the imagery of the film will be a key sales point. They realize that people don't see films before they buy tickets. They only see posters before they buy tickets. So they design up posters that are going to be appealing.
Misleading.
Exactly. Yes. It's film as business, right? Rather than film as any form of artistry, which of course had been dying out for a while in Hollywood, but really kind of, the death knell of it is AIP. For a while at least. So this is a period where the teenager, when I say they've come of age because Hollywood is looking right at them, right? It's targeting product to them. And within that, along comes The Blob, which looks like a 1950s science fiction movie. It's got all the trappings of the science fiction movie. And Roger, you may well disagree with me about this, but to my mind, at least, it's got none of the ideological content of the golden age of 50s science fiction cinema. So if the 50s have been characterized in science fiction terms in film, as an age where we had, body snatching horrors that were effectively, in code, the communists coming to get you, the Reds under the beds and so forth. Or we have these kind of apocalyptic monsters that rain down destruction on cities and were code for the nuclear bomb. To my mind, I really don't think the Blob's doing any of that. It's got the visual trappings of bits and pieces of it, and we can debate that, I'm sure, but it's much more a story about teenagers. It's much more a film about teenagers doing hot rod racing and romances and saving the day in the end. An army of them coming out with fire extinguishers to save the day in the final reel. So it's much more kind of a celebration of teen culture, which doesn't quite fit with the Hollywood science fiction golden age that goes before it, but also doesn't quite sit with those delinquency films, because these aren't delinquents, right? They're our kind of heroes of this movie. So it's an odd transition that takes us through from this kind of late 50s moment where what's gone before has come of age and kind of run out of steam a wee bit, and the 1960s, where it's all Bonnie and Clyde and teen anti-heroes. So it kind of fills a moment, right? It's kind of a gap in that film history.
Yeah, very interesting. They called that the Peter Pan syndrome, which was the formula you talked about from AIP. And Samuel Arkoff had his he used his surname to come up with the elements that were to be formulas from AIP, which was action, revolution, which means not like rebellion, but interesting new controversial ideas. Killing, oratory, which means notable dialogue and speeches. I'm not sure if they always stuck to that. Fantasy, and then fornication. So that was those are things coming out of AIP in the late 1950s, and a lot of indie filmmaking that was going on then. Can we talk a little bit about the readings? Because we are still in, the 1950s, nuclear age, Red Scare. There is literally a big red scary thing in this film. I do agree with you, Matt, that it is a bit of a red herring, a red blob,
a blobby herring.
Yeah. But you can see why people might read it as that. Can you talk a bit about those kind of readings of it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think I have a fresh theory about the Blob. If you're in the 50s, what you're looking at is a giant Jello, and Jello, the dessert, was massively popular in the 50s. It's invented in the 1890s. It's kind of this gelatin sort of hardened stuff. They did really weird things with it in the 50s. They mostly put it on salads, unbelievably. There was a kind of famous element of this is the sweet dessert that you can eat. Now, crucially, we're in the era of just after McCarthyism, really, that kind of grip of Senator McCarthy, who interrogated, and said there were 200 communists in the American government, and they went after Hollywood directors and writers and got quite a lot blacklisted and so on. Some people argue that some of them went then on to genre fiction, so science fiction is kind of bound up with that. All of that. But one of the biggest show trials in that period was of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who were claimed to be communist spies who had passed on secrets from the Manhattan Project to the Soviets. And one of the key evidence elements of the case against them was a packet of Jello. They kind of tore a Jello packet in half, and the other half was then given over to their contact. So in other words, Jello was kind of a crucial element of this. And people were constantly portrayed them as these are ordinary, normal, seemingly, safe suburban people, but actually secretly they're communists. So I think this kind of quivering blob of Jello, which is beginning to kind of absorb a suburban kind of town, does have that kind of element of it as well. What I really like, though, about 50s B movies is they're constantly ambivalent, so you can never pin it down. I mean, some are screamingly anti-communist, and but they're the least interesting ones, actually, because something like Invasion of the Body Snatchers is also about a terror of conformity and the organization man, it was called at the time. This real worry that everyone was wearing the same suits and going to the same offices in the same Levittown, suburbs and so on. So there's a kind of an element which you can read in two ways, both as a kind of anti-communist thing, but also as a kind of fear of suburban boredom and conformity. And I think the Blob kind of rests on, it's kind of out of that intense hysterical kind of moment of McCarthyism, but there's still a little bit of a trace of that. And of course, Eisenhower is still, there and banging on about the threat of communism. This is the height of nuclear war anxiety and so on. So it is still there. But I agree with Matt. In the end, these are teenagers that are there to save the day rather than subvert it. They do literally say, "We're going to go to the police. They'll know what to do." You don't hear any teenager really sign up to that in Rebel Without a Cause, right? Yeah, it's not James Dean. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
The other thing that taps into is, of course, kind of questions around domesticity at the time as well, right? So this is an age of growing convenience in the household, and Jello is part of that. So I can't believe we're having a serious academic discussion about Jello. This is awesome.
Absolutely crucial.
We need to talk more often, Roger. Kind of the place of Jello in the American household is domesticity, the kitchen. So you could also make gendered readings of this too. I tend to be much more straightforward, which I think tells you something about me more than about the film. And just say, well, yeah, but the jelly goo is cheap and easy and looks slightly monstrous when you zoom in on it a bit, and easily kind of with the trickery of kind of perspective and so forth, easily produced as special effect that looks reasonably impressive and super cheap on film. So I suspect that none of this is intentional. I'm not saying that those aren't readings that are available. They absolutely are, and I can see the logic of that very, very clearly. But is any of that kind of intended? I suspect this is just some people with some cheap goo, right?
Oh, of course. Yeah. But as soon as this goes into circulation, you kind of lose control of that. And I think what you're saying about these kind of happy accidents, really, and the sort of sense of improvisation that has to happen in B movies, they get kind of loaded with this incredible kind of density of semiotic meaning. And actually, it's probably purely hazard. But of course, we're never in control of our historical moment or understand quite how it's, directing and controlling our sense of self. So when, someone like Susan Sontag in the 1960s says, all of these B movies are completely devoid of social ideas, she famously and outrageously says. And you just think, it's full of ideas, actually. It's got loads of ideas. It's what you bring to it rather than, what might be there.
And I do think that the reason I did this podcast is, okay, we've got the intention, but the interpretation is what's really fascinating to me, is that it's more about that social and historical context, which is why I'm here. So, who knows what's intended? It's out of their hands now. One thing I really liked in the story that was in Weird Tales from Joseph Payne Brennan is just this quote. I just wanted to say it because the horror did not know fear. There was nothing to be afraid of. And when I read that line, I just thought, I'd really like to experience it from the point of view of the Blob, like he seems to be.
What, these days? Like the news every day bring in horror? Yeah, no, that would be lovely.
That sounds awesome. Anyway.
That's the Martians in War of the Worlds, isn't it, right? They arrive and just don't see humans as any threat whatsoever, so they just go about doing what they're doing. In the same way that the British Empire had not seen native cultures around the world as a threat, so it just went about doing what it's doing. Here, I guess, the Blob is our colonizing force, right? So overpowered that it just doesn't recognize. It just does what it does.
Yeah, and I also, there are many kind of potential sources for this, and Joseph Brennan, who wrote that story in 1953, did, I think, sue Paramount over, this is my idea. And actually, if you go back to the first edition of Weird Tales in 1923, the opening story is called Ooze. So it is a kind of sense of abject, formless things that really kind of freak you out. I've also read that actually the Blob is partly to do with that whole myth of star jelly, which is this when you get these kind of strange, it's gone on for centuries, this belief that actually meteorites are bringing this kind of strange jelly, which might be some form of life.
And they don't know what it is, do they?
No, they don't know what it is. It's
this jelly around the world, which has been going on for centuries? And they have no idea what it is. It's got no DNA in it. Yeah. And they find it out in the fields.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's so strange.
Yeah, and there was a big case of that, I think, in 1950, which in America, which caused lots of anxiety, given that this is, the very start of the Cold War and mutually assured destruction and so on. And of course, it's like 2 years into the UFO flying saucer craze. So there is a sort of sense then that they are picking up on not just kind of fictional sources, because the Gothic loves the abject and the formless, and the thing that oozes over you and kind of you lose your boundaries to. But there's also this kind of immediate context about, anxieties about keep watching the skies as they kept shouting at you in B movies in the 50s.
Wonderful. Can we talk a little bit about the tone of the film? Because I absolutely, and although I adore it, I'm getting slightly sick of the fact that it's playing in a loop in my head, is the theme song.
You'll never get that out of your head, ever. It's part of you now.
Yeah, it's been about 3 days. Yeah. But it's obviously got this really lighthearted feel straight off the bat. But then it has a real earnestness to it. Matt, you mentioned why there might be two different tones in this story.
Yeah, so this is a film that is apparently originally intended as kind of serious, scary fare. That the intention behind its production was that this would be a kind of a science fiction horror movie. These weren't the terms that they were using necessarily at the time, but that it would be genuinely scary, and that would be its appeal. That then reaches a bit of a wall before release, where Paramount comes along and looks at it and goes, that's not overly scary, though, is it? It's a giant weird thing that looks more funny than scary, and it's beaten by effectively being put in a fridge. Like, can we rethink the intention of this here? So there's a
keep your Jello in the fridge, guys.
Right? Yeah, sorry. Don't leave it out on the counter. That's not good. Don't put it in a salad. That's awful. But the upshot of this is that they come back to that tone of it and say, well, okay, we can have our scary moments within it, and there are genuinely some kind of quite creepy bits to it too. Scary, I think, is probably a stretch, but then maybe I'm a hardened cynic on that stuff. But the opening of it, with the theme tune kind of playing over it, this kind of effective kind of proto 60s pop song, right? Playing over it, which is, I mean, written by Burt Bacharach, right?
I love it. I love it so much. I shouldn't have complained about it. So Burt Bacharach wrote this. He's not famous at the time, but at the time he's touring around with Marlene Dietrich. I just think that's wonderful. Like, what a great time of his life.
Yeah, that's a green room I would love to be in, right? But so Bacharach writes this kind of catchy proto-60s pop jingle style kind of kitschy song for it, the Blob, which then gets cut into the beginning of the movie. So you get it kind of playing at the start. And it's so campy, and it's so kind of silly, and it's so, I mean, fundamentally unserious, right? Like, you can't take that as the opening of a scary movie in any way, shape, or form. So it kind of resets the tone of what's to follow. It reframes it as a jolly good time rather than as a spooky experience. So they don't change too much, actually, about the remainder of the movie. But just that song is powerful enough that it reconfigures audience expectation on their way in the door. And it's a really powerful argument for the way that you open your film, really kind of changing the perception of the movie by an audience. It really radically does that, and so this film is enjoyed both as like a spooky old time, but primarily is just a good night out, proper drive-in fare, right? Check your worries at the door, which I think kind of, to bring us back ever so slightly to the Jello and the Rosenbergs, it militates against arguing for political interpretations of the movie. People aren't there going, oh, well, is this communism? They're sat there having a lovely old time because the theme song has partly encouraged them to go, throw your cares away. This is a campy romp, as it were. And it plays out marvelously and means that you can excuse all sorts of failings in the movie because it's not taking itself seriously. So then, the odd quirk in the special effects, if we could put it that way, the kind of moments where things are slightly less persuasive, the odd bit of clunky dialogue, of forced plotting, like all of that stuff is completely forgiven because it's not, or it's told you it's not there to be taken seriously.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so that's the beginning. I think I totally agree with you, Matt. That's the beginning. But I think lots of these films feel like dream states because they move in tone, shift in tone all the time, and they're not designed to be coherent. In fact, it's like it's an advantage to be incoherent. You have these strange longueurs with really, really long kind of conversations that are very static and not especially interesting. But there's I think a really interesting moment towards the end of the film when you go inside a cinema itself.
Now
All the images of horror, the demons of your mind crowd in on you to destroy you.
And what the friends of the mysteriously old Steve McQueen are watching is,
which we do need to touch upon, but
it is dementia. So this is a film that was actually quite avant-garde. It's quite high kind of art stuff. I mean, it was a shock narrative about on a wordless film, an hour-long wordless kind of descent into Skid Row and the hell of Los Angeles. So horrifying, in fact, that it was banned. And then Jack Harris, the producer of this film, bought it and recut it and extended it into the film that they're watching, Daughters of Horror. So it seems to me that moment, and they're watching it in somewhere called the Colonial Cinema, which I also really love, they're kind of reflecting on kind of cultural value and thinking about, the place of horror in science fiction. And it's almost as if, I didn't know you guys were into spooky films. Well, we're not, because it's happening outside. So, we need to take the teenagers out to save the day and get away from kind of, representation and chaos and exaggerated emotional affect, and kind of go into the streets and save the day literally ourselves alongside the police rather
get
than,
those fire extinguishers, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, get those fire extinguishers. Let's freeze this thing. So there's a kind of reflection on its own kind of cultural status, I think. I mean, certainly by the end of the 50s, people know that this is, the lowest form of mass culture. I mean, there was a left-wing critic called Dwight MacDonald who wrote a lot in the 50s about mass culture, the arrival of mass culture, and the left were very anxious about it just as much as the right were, actually. But he talked about these kinds of films as, to quote him directly, spreading ooze. So that kind of sense of the Blob is itself a kind of, is this the mass culture that's absorbing our teens? That's a sense of reflecting on that. Now, of course, I don't think that Jack Harris was sitting around thinking, what a brilliant metafictional moment we can have here, at all. But nearly all genres reflect on themselves, and need to locate themselves in a genre.
The housing of horror within a cinema, and kind of that moment of really quite self-conscious kind of, hey, we're a horror movie. It pauses and kind of signifies that quite clearly. I've always read that slightly differently, I think, perhaps as a hangover from the original intentions, right, of this being a genuinely spooky, scary movie, and of kind of the projection of older horror, of different types of horror, of kind of other horrors onto the screen, and then the emergence of these new atomic age horrors, the Blob outside the door, rather than the kind of the silent horror, the wordless horror, as you say, inside the room. Kind of the signaling of, well, if that isn't scary, don't worry, this is what the future holds. I wish I'd seen this in movie theaters, because that moment is just so special. I mean, I love any film that's set in a movie theater. The opening of Scream 2 will always go down in my top 10 list. But there's that kind of wonderful self-reflective quality to it that I always think is much more special than is perhaps kind of warranted in it now. That kind of intention of being horrific is taken away. It loses something in that. But actually, I much prefer your reading of it, because that means that I can read it as intentional rather than leftover gubbins from something else.
Yeah, and I think the other thing to bear in mind is how these sort of films are consumed. They're consumed in double bills, and this might well be the kind of light half and the kind of full gory Technicolor version with the other film that it kind of toured around with, and that was I Married a Monster from Outer Space, which actually is genuinely kind of affecting and full of, it's black and white. It was directed by Gene Fowler, who'd worked with Fritz Lang. It was, someone who is kind of full of, that film is full of dread and anxiety, sexual anxiety, particularly a newly married young woman who's not entirely sure whether her husband is a monster or not. In a kind of classic B-movie, kind of hardly displaced Freudian anxiety. So you might try and picture a kind of almost like a date double bill here, where you have your comic kind of light-hearted half, but then you also have your much more anxious and dread-filled half. And which order they come in would make for a different outcome of a date, I imagine.
Thinking back on those love seats that we were talking about last time, I was on the podcast, actually, the double seats in the back row.
Yeah, put the comedy first.
Okay, yeah, probably.
Okay, so I do want to mention Steve McQueen because I, first of all, adore him. But after that amazing theme song, it comes in on his face. And it took me quite a while to realise that this man, who was 27 or 28 when he played this, is supposed to be 17 years old, which I think is absolutely wonderful and quite hilarious.
It's a shooting star.
I thought you were supposed to wish on shooting stars.
But I did.
But we only saw one.
But you see a lot of them up here at night.
What?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of them out at night. You don't see them in town. That's why I come up here. Oh, no, that's not what I mean. I mean, you can see them better up here.
I know what you mean, Steve.
But this is his first lead feature film, and then he goes on to become the King of Cool. But he's not the King of Cool in this film, is he, Matt?
No, he is not. It's so interesting, isn't it? Because at this point, he's somewhere between the Steve McQueen that would be and the Jimmy Dean of a few years before, where you can see him trying to capture that kind of teen cool vibe, but he's just not got the performance down yet. He's not got that mode of the teen heroes of the time, or indeed of what he would become. So he sits as this weird kind of halfway house where, I mean, it doesn't take me a while to accept that he's supposed to be 17 because I never accept that he's supposed to be 17.
When they're like, you kids, and I'm like, which kids? Who are we talking about?
Are there kids in the room with us now? Yeah, it never settles. He is so demonstrably not a 17-year-old. And, I say this as someone who grew up watching Dawson's Creek, where I had 30-year-olds playing teenagers all the way through. Like, this isn't something that goes away. It continues.
Grease is a very famous one for older teens, yeah.
Absolutely spot on. So he's oddly positioned, I think. One could argue kind of miscast, but I obviously would never say such a thing. But he's oddly positioned through most of this movie in that he's meant to be leading this kind of rebellious teen charge. And we've talked about the appeal of the teenager, the evolution of the teenager. And because he doesn't quite look like a teenager, he doesn't quite behave like a teenager, he doesn't quite fit the slot in that society of a teenager. People don't treat him like a teenager. They treat him, I mean, in a number of different ways. Sometimes as like proto-action hero, sometimes as a kind of romantic hero, sometimes as a problem to be solved, sometimes as an aid to the police force. Like, he fits into all these weird roles, some of which are appropriate for his age, the actor's age, some of which are appropriate for the character's age, because he just doesn't fit, and because no one knows how to treat him as a result, and the script doesn't really know whether he's 17 or not either. So he occupies a really odd space in it that gestures to what he'll become. He's building an image for himself here, right? Like, it's the beginnings of something. But it's clearly a proto Steve McQueen. It's not Steve McQueen as he would be.
And in fact, the only film where he's credited as Stephen McQueen. So I guess...
Yes.
I always wonder if, how much of the kind of persona of Steve McQueen was known at that point. Because, was he cast because he was, in fact, a teenage juvenile delinquent, and had been in and out of all kinds of correctional facilities during a very difficult childhood, and you get a kind of element of that, and that's sort of maybe the danger of that, but also there's no doubt with all of the adults in the film, the other adults in the film, that he is a kind of he's an authority figure, someone to be trusted.
What else could I do?
Well, give us a chance to find out what happened. You know we didn't tear up Doc's house.
Look, how long have you known me, Dave? Have I ever done anything
All
like
right,
that before?
all right, I
did.
believe you.
Given that he's almost as old as his dad in the film, perhaps that's kind of why. But he doesn't have that edge of danger that James Dean had, or the sexual ambiguity that James Dean had in Rebel Without a Cause, a very queer film in all kinds of ways, not least because it was directed by Nicholas Ray. And that's the kind of, that's the sort of, I guess, the reference point here. And so he's kind of half towards that, I agree. And then the other half is, but actually we're quite secure in his moral and sexual kind of identity. He's kind of safe over there. And then he's also, he's not a film star at this point, but he is becoming a TV star, and that's how he kind of got his break through Wanted Dead or Alive, which is, it's just starting as he's making this film as well. So whether there's that, also half in, half out of film acting, because it's a very awkward performance, I think, in the film. It's not calibrated to the kind of hysteria that it requires. He's kind of an odd sort of calm. He's the leader of the fire brigade as he is in the Towering Inferno. It's this very kind of calm sort of figure. In fact, there's lots of fire extinguishers all the way through his career. In fact,
spot on. I wonder about that kind of evolving notion of what a teenager is.
I was going to ask you, Matt, about whether, because in the 50s you also get The Bad Seed, which is a very famous film about a young girl under 10 who has murderous intent.
Yes.
But you also have Village of the Damned over here, which is like very scary, but again about 10. They're before that. So it seems to be that we've got a kind of the horror film is developing the evil child, the Omen kind of idea of Damien stuff. But the teenager seems to be much more kind of as it is in culture, transitional kind of figure.
Yeah, and much more bound up with notions of fun, actually, than notions of horror. By this stage, at least, as I say, when it emerges, it's kind of a social horror, but not necessarily kind of a horror film horror, if you see what I mean. Whereas by this point, teenagers they're shifting more into, they're not there yet by any stretch, but they're shifting more into that kind of grease mode of fun and romance and silliness. We're getting towards that point. So we've moved away from teenagers as a figure of mystery, which you do get. Jimmy Dean is part of that, and all that ambiguity around Jimmy Dean that you point out. All of that is part of the mystification of the teenager in its early emergence. The idea that teenagers are unknowable, right? They're weird creatures that are not like us, but also aren't like young children, which we can control and master. These are kind of strange figures that rebel against us. But the teenager has gone from that kind of unknowability, and then eventually will become much more settled, familiar, knowable, controllable, and then we end up with Grease and the kind of the knowable teen movies, if we can think of them that way. This is that weird midway point. I think it's a performance and a moment and a script that talk to that unsettled nature of teenness in the late 50s. It's not quite your 60s, but it's not quite your early 50s either, right?
The idea of a problematic teenage is how the policeman who's kind of against them and doesn't believe them, that's how he views them.
Every kid in town in on this. Now, I don't know who this is, but let me tell you, you're going to wish you never thought of this. Hello? Hello?
And this whole film kind of almost flips that round. It's like a nice 1958. It's kind of around when we go from the problematic teenager to, perhaps the kids are okay kind of thing. But yeah, I think Steve McQueen's interesting because he's going to become this huge star in the 60s and 70s and not the type of star that was big in the 50s, which was kind of cleaner cut. It's that anti-hero thing.
It's an odd thing to see someone who would become such a recognizable, established persona when they're not quite that established, recognizable persona yet, right? It's a wee bit unsettling from time to time, but not unsettling in the way that the film wants to be, right?
The small child is slightly unsettling because he's very tall, but acts like a small child.
Hey, now you be quiet. Shh.
I'm not afraid.
Well, I know you're not.
And I think that's the thing, that both Steve McQueen and this child just needed to be a little bit younger.
Like there's a weird subplot going on where people age rapidly in this town for no obvious reason.
Yeah. It's interesting how they do that. I just wanted to point out that Jane, who's the female lead in this, at one point says, and I only want to mention this because it is going to become my Wilhelm scream, which is, what are we going to do? Which Reese Witherspoon brought up a while ago, that when she gets a script on her desk, the one thing that will make her stop reading it immediately is if a woman turns to someone and says, "What are we going to do?" And so now every time I hear a woman say that in a script, I'm like, "Oh, it's the Reese Witherspoon like thing." So I just had to mention that. Okay, can we go on to the legacy of the film? Because I think it's got quite a big legacy. Roger, let's go with you first.
Well, of course, there are two follow-up films, and actually it flows quite neatly from the discussion we've just had about the changing conception of teens. So the next film, which is unbelievably directed by Larry Hagman, he was famous for Dallas, and the teenagers in that are very distinctly, the hippie generation, but also confusingly, they're the ones who kind of save the day as well. So there's quite a lot inside that film, which is truly awful, by the way. I do think the film is worth watching just for one line, which is, the again, not quite a clean cut, but a kind of, a safe hippie male kind of lead who says the fantastic line, "Let's go back to my place and have an avocado sandwich."
That's marvelous.
And he says that not only once, but twice. And then towards the end of the film, in a moment of extreme danger, he says, "We should have gone home and had an avocado sandwich."
As someone who married a Californian, I can't tell you how many avocado sandwiches I've been encouraged to go home for.
Right, absolutely. Now, again, I've been obsessed with this line. Why would you say that line? But I have a now retired colleague who always talked about seeing their first ever avocado in the West Midlands in the UK in 1970. So it feels like this cutting edge stuff. This avocado.
I do want to just quickly mention that I've seen so many films for this podcast so far, which is coming up to a year. And this is the only one I found extremely difficult to get through.
It's dreadful. It's truly
It is really bad.
Yeah.
It is really bad. And then it was also remade again in 1988. So we're at the height of Reaganism there. It's actually written by Frank Darabont. He's a great adapter of Stephen King, actually. The film The Mist by Frank Darabont is absolutely brilliant. So he's kind of, he cut his chops with things like The Blob. But in that case, again, it's kind of shifting slightly to do with the era and the moment. So you've got a return of really kind of heightened Cold War anxiety, a nuclear threat in the 1980s, kind of, prompted by Reagan and stuff. So there's that, but then there's also a whole other weird element of The Blob, which maybe we can talk about, which is its emergence in right-wing discourse. So in 1988, the year that remake came out, the very conservative education secretary in the US talked about the educational establishment as the blob. Wow. And this was kind of meant to be kind of bureaucratic, kind of, but also groupthink, liberal, progressive, resistant to change. They wanted child-centered learning and all this hippie nonsense. And they wanted to get back to another kind of, much stricter, older, actually 50s version of what education should be. And then that was picked up again, like 20 years later by an education minister in the UK, Michael Gove, who talked obsessively about the blob from around about 2013 when he was education minister and put through lots and lots of very kind of controversial reforms, but was constantly arguing that I'm being resisted by the blob, which is the education establishment. And that has been constant in right-wing discourse for the last, 12 or so years. People talk about the blob all the time. If you do a kind of Google search of it, you'll get articles from the Daily Mail, the Daily Telegraph, the Spectator, who are the blob. The blob keeps changing. It keeps absorbing ever more people that are resistant to right-wing kind of discourse. So it's got this really strange afterlife, which I think is almost as interesting, actually, as the film itself. None of those people are watching this film, by the way. They've got an idea of it, but actually, it's kind of it's moved on into a blobby influence itself.
Interesting. Matt, do you have anything to say about the legacy?
I would emphasize, do not watch the second one unless you can avoid it. It's interesting because it has many names. It goes by The Blob 2. It goes by Beware the Blob. It sometimes goes by Son of the Blob. And I always wondered whether that was to do with trying to make it appealing to an audience that have long since forgotten the Blob, because this is many, many years later, or whether it's actually an attempt to disguise it as different movies, so that, once the reviews have come out and everyone knows that it's dreadful, like, oh, don't worry, this isn't that movie, this is another one. It's truly bad, but it's also partly that it's missed its moment, right? Like the Blob works in 58 because of where special effects are at the time. It sits within a particular kind of visual environment of 1950 science fiction. By the 70s, we've seen better, so it doesn't quite sit nicely in that cinematic moment. It doesn't fit nicely with the science fiction that's going on at the time. By this point, we're well past our 2001 moments. Tastes have changed. By the time we get to the 80s and the remake of the original Blob, times have changed once again, and we're in a much more kind of paranoid, post-Watergate age, where the Blob is no longer just an accident that's happened. It doesn't just drop out of space and happen to be here, and now chaos ensues, which is that kind of that view of the 50s, that we're here kind of building our nuclear weapons, but also like you can't control science. Like it's we can do our best and we can make these marvels out of it, but actually there's always an unknowability to the universe that is just beyond our ken. And the Blob, emerges from that. By the 80s, it's a bioweapon, effectively, a Cold War bioweapon that has been developed and then kind of goes wrong and so on and so on. And you end up with a much more conspiracy-driven movie where this is human activity that has produced the threat, rather than just something from beyond. That kind of vaguely Lovecraftian notion of monsters from the beyond that we'll never truly understand. We just shove them in the freezer and hope for the best. That's well gone by the time of the 80s. And so you end up with something that feels much more earthbound, something much more familiar, that has come from a laboratory or an office somewhere originally. They put in a whole explanation for it, but its conception comes from here, not from out there, and so it feels much more tameable and much more kind of manageable, I guess. They do their best. They throw out all the purple goo that you can imagine, and it's that the visual palette of it is so of its moment. It reeks of the 80s, and so it's just another movie, right? It's just another film. And since then, there have been talks of a remake, of course. Since the early 2000s, that's been circulating, and I think has been stuck in development hell for the best part of 3 decades now. Lord knows where it is at the moment. I don't think we will ever see it. If we do, it will be a long, long way away yet. When I think of the Blob, it feels like something of my grandmother's era. It doesn't feel like it could be contemporized. A blob of amorphous matter is no longer threatening in a world where gestures to the bin fire outside the window, right? Like the world has changed since then.
I did want to mention a few things. First of all, I think the French title, which I'm going to butcher because I do not speak French, which is Attention or Blob.
Fantastic.
This is the sequel, sorry. This is the sequel, the one that I hated, but I love the title for that one. Watching the remake, and actually the original, it reminded me of Ghostbusters too, because there is a river of slime. So I think that's part of the legacy. It's a pink slime. And when I watch the remake and they're in the sewers and it's there, I'm like, oh, interesting.
Yeah.
And a claim that I found on a couple of places, including a vintage movie poster website, which is probably, it might help sell the poster. But Steve McQueen had the poster of the film The Blob on his bedroom wall at the time of his death, apparently.
Really? It watched over him.
Right. He was still pretending to be a teenager even then.
It's also interesting because we mentioned Billy Graham before, that Steve McQueen in his last few months or years before he passed away did become a born-again Christian and was connected to Billy Graham. So Billy Graham runs from the director all the way to the passing away of the amazing Steve McQueen. Can we talk a little bit about your recommendations for the listeners, please?
So it is also 1958, which is one of the tie-ins. It is from the UK rather than the US, but it is also about slightly blobby, unknowable things that is a campy good time. This is a film called The Trollenberg Terror, which was released in the US, I believe, as The Crawling Eye. And is it's a really wonderful little movie that is one that, again, you have to take as a good time rather than anything genuinely scary, particularly now. But it's monsters atop a like weird. I think in my book I call them space testicles because they've got that kind of weird gooiness to. Let's not go too much into that. But they hang out atop a Swiss observatory on a mountain hidden in a cloud, and so they're kind of that otherworldly, unknowable thing. They're not absorbing people, but they do kind of, grab a child and take her up the hill. They consume a few people from the town. But there's certainly that sense of it being a thing from out there that we don't really have a grasp on. And at the same time of it being a 1958 transitional movie, certainly you're seeing a transition in what it means to be a British man at the time, I think, in particular. That move away from kind of the colonial kind of agents of colony into a slightly more 1960s mode, starting to emerge around the corners. I might be over-egging that a touch, but it's certainly there in the fabric of the movie. So yes, The Trollenberg Terror, also from 1958, an absolute hidden gem.
Wonderful. Roger?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. It is a really interesting film. And then I think if you're going to watch the original Blob, I would do it as a double bill, actually, with I Married a Monster from Outer Space.
Which is convenient because that's the film we'll be doing next on the podcast.
It's tonally very different, but I think it's a really oddly affecting and effective film, I think, from the time. And then I just thinking, as you were talking about, why there hasn't been a remake of the Blob. It's perhaps because we're in a kind of, gooey horror kind of moment right now. Something like Richard Stanley's Colour Out of Space, which has kind of, again, a mysterious jelly from beyond that kind of absorbs, Nicolas Cage and most of his family. It's a truly extraordinary, as usual, Nicolas Cage performance. Slightly problematic now in the director has been cancelled, but it's a good example of where we might be in the last kind of few years with this kind of sense of the abject, formless, encroaching horror.
And of course, is itself a Lovecraft adaptation.
It is, yeah, absolutely.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to both of you for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been great.
Great. That's it for this episode. Thank you so much for everyone listening, and thank you so much for those of you who've tried to contact and support the show. It means so much to me. Next episode, we will be talking about I Married a Monster from Outer Space, which was mentioned a couple of times in this episode. If you want to find out where you can watch that, I will leave some details in the show notes. And as always, if you can leave any reviews or ratings for the podcast, subscribe, it helps the show immensely. There will be some details about advertising and potential subscriptions later in the year, so I just wanted to prepare you for those. And thank you so much again for all your support. Bye-bye.